Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusek, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. Habemus Papam Americanum. The common wisdom up until a few weeks ago was that the church would never have a pope from the United States, or at least not until the U.S. ceases to be an economic and political superpower. But then, on May 8th, 2025, the College of Cardinals stunned the world by electing Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, a native of the south side of Chicago. Before becoming Pope, Prevost, who has now taken the name Leo XIV, spent nearly 2 decades in Peru as an Augustinian missionary and gained significant experience working with the global church in the Vatican. He is, to be sure, a man of the world. A biographical fact he emphasized by speaking in Latin, Italian, and Spanish, not English, during his first introduction to the jubilant crowds in St. Peter's Square. All the same, Pope Leo XIV is and always will be a native son of the United States, a first in church history. So what kind of papacy should we expect from the American Pope? How should we interpret his papal name and his background as the former head of the Augustinian religious order? Are there any early signs of what his ecclesial, diplomatic, and moral priorities will be? And how should we think about him in relationship to his predecessors, including Pope Francis? Here to talk through these and related questions and to share his own experience of what it was like to watch the whole conclave unfold in person is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, welcome back to the studio.
Thanks, Matt. Always good to be with you.
So today we're talking about what we might be able to expect from a Pope Leo XIV. I'm still getting used to saying that, Pope Leo XIV papacy, and what it was like for you to be there as the whole drama unfolded. But before we do, you also recently took another trip to our nation's capital to spend some time in a rather famous rose garden. So tell us a little bit about what that was about.
An extraordinary about 10 days, because I was with the president in the rose garden, and then about 2 days later, I flew to Rome to be there for the papal election. So it was a wild 10 days. Well, I was invited by the president to be part of this commission on religious liberty. And, we bishops have been concerned with religious liberty now for the past, 25, 30 years. It's been a major concern of ours. We have a committee dedicated to it. I'm on that committee. So when I got that invitation from the president, I thought, well, look, he's reaching out to a Catholic bishop to seek advice on an issue that we bishops think is of enormous significance. But why would I say no to that? So that's what motivated me to do it. Then they invited me to come to the ceremony and do a prayer at it. So that's why I actually went to Washington. I got a terrible sunburn with my Irish skin sitting in the rose garden because the president was delayed about an hour, whatever he was doing. And then he gave kind of a long speech. And the whole time, the sun is just beating down on me. So when I got to Rome, I was in kind of bad shape. It was like when I was a kid. I would get sunburned and my skin would peel and all that. So I had an adventure in dermatology at the rose garden. But it was an interesting day. And President Trump spoke about religious liberty and lots of other things. And then he invited us briefly into the Oval Office, for pictures. And we're going to meet a lot, actually, in the coming year. I think it's every month with a couple of exceptions. And then we're supposed to produce a document by next July, by the anniversary, the 250th anniversary of the country, recommending, some changes and maybe in our public policy and about religious liberty. So that's the charge of the commission. A person I thought of a lot after I got the invitation was the famous Father Theodore Hesburgh, who was president of Notre Dame University back in the 20th century from, I think, 1952 to 1987. Hesburgh was a major public figure, and I checked this with my friend, Father Bill Miscampbell, who is a biographer of Hesburgh. He said, yes, he served on 16 separate presidential commissions under 5 presidents, 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats. So Hesburgh, civil rights and many other things. I thought, well, that's really what I'm doing here is accepting invitation from the president. And something Hesburgh said, I noticed, was it's hard to say no to the president. And I think that's true. Not that you're co-opted or brought into endorsing every single policy, but on this particular issue, he's seeking my advice. Right. I'm happy to give that.
Well, this news was widely cheered within the church, online, and outside of the church as well. But some usual quarters of complaint registered some principled objections. So what do you say to critics who say, look, a Catholic bishop does not belong on anything formally to do with any administration.
I just that's false. All he's asking for is advice in the formulation of public policy. Why not be a Catholic voice around that table? If the president's reaching out to say, help me formulate good public policy in this regard, we think it's very important, and he wants a Catholic voice around the table. Why would I say no to that?
Right.
If it ever reached a point where I felt that principles were being compromised or something was being done that I was opposed to, I'd quit. Look, I'm not angling to become governor of Arkansas or something. I mean, what can the president give me? I got a sunburn from being in the Oval or in the Rose Garden, but I mean, I'm not angling for political position.
Right.
So
what's the benefit? Yeah.
No. So I just see myself as offering a Catholic perspective on these things, and the commission will last maybe for a year, and then it'll be over.
Yeah.
So no, I think those are silly objections.
Yeah, it's a highly commonsensical
And then
response.
again, the same thing will be against Hesburgh. Why not go after Hesburgh for 16 times becoming a presidential commissioner?
Right. Well, let's now turn to today's topic, which is looking at this new papacy, the stunning election of Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost to the papacy, who's now taken the name of Leo XIV. Before analyzing his background, his theological influences, the significance of his name, everybody wants to hear what the experience was like for you to be there on the ground before the conclave started to its conclusion. What was that like?
It was exciting. I was there 12 years ago doing commentary for NBC. And it was funny, man. I don't remember that as being, how would I put it, as being somewhat exciting, or I wasn't nervous. I was just there, and okay, they're electing the Pope, and who's it going to be? Well, let's find out. This time around, I think everybody was a little more on tenterhooks, and well, who's it going to be? And what direction will the church go in? And so there was that excitement about it.
Do you have a sense of why there was that difference?
I don't know entirely. Maybe just for me, because I'm a little more engaged. I wasn't a bishop, 12 years ago. I was rector of the seminary at the time, but not a bishop yet. But there was great interest, excitement about it. And then the way the election unfolded was so surprising, because a lot of us were expecting a longer conclave, that there'd be more divisions and they have to kind of work through and maybe find a compromise candidate. So I was predicting, Friday, and maybe there'd be 7, 8, or 9 ballots or something. Turned out to be exceptionally fast. And I was actually on the roof of Bambina Maria, which is this religious house right next to St. Peter's, and NBC was on top of that. Or maybe it was the Augustinian, but one of the two. I was right there overlooking St. Peter's, and I was being interviewed, and I was just responding, looking into the camera. Nobody at that moment was expecting white smoke.
That's
no
right.
one.
Yeah.
And I'm just talking away, and suddenly behind me is this roar goes up. And I was like, wait, what are they possibly reacting to? And then someone goes, white smoke, white smoke. So that was unexpected. Then I had to race over to Fox News, because I'd agreed to be with them when the Pope came out. So we raced across the city of Rome. And then when the announcement was made, I was even more flabbergasted.
Right.
Prevost's name had been mentioned, but all of us, myself included, all the commentators were like, I suppose it's possible, but they're not going to elect an American. I used the argument that Francis George always used, which was, until America goes into political, decline, it won't happen, because we're the superpower. We run the world politically, economically. We dominate the popular culture. They're not going to give us the church too. That was always the way Cardinal George put it. And I thought that's right. I think most people thought that was right. Well, it was wrong. They did elect an American, to everyone's enormous surprise. I knew him a little bit because, see, for me, a precursor of the conclave were the two synods.
Right.
I was there the last 2 Octobers, 2023, 2024. In the room at the synod, there were 400 of us. There were 60 cardinals. So I often said to people during the synod, I bet the next pope is in this room. Turned out to be true. But I can tell you this, no one would have said, oh, yeah, and it's Robert Prevost. I think we all would have said, Barron or Tagle or, turned out he was in the room. So I knew Prevost from the synod a bit. I remember the first time we met, I said to him, I'm from Chicago too. And I said, you've been given a big job, because he was head of the bishop's dicastery. He'd just been named. I had no idea he was going to get a pretty much bigger job, a few years later. And we just chatted about Chicago a bit and people we knew in common. Quiet man, not a flashy personality, smart, obviously, very experienced in different ways. But he's not someone that you would stand out in the room like, oh, that guy, boy, he's got the big personality. Just the opposite. So, all that contributed to my experience of being over there. I was flabbergasted, I must say, when the name was announced. And that added to the excitement of it.
Oh, well, you and everyone else. We'll talk more about the American part of his identity. But to back up sort of before the conclave, there was a lot of chatter that the fact that Pope Francis had selected so many cardinals from outside the traditional power centers, outside of the Vatican, that was going to have a significant influence on the new pope. Do you think that prediction played out in any way?
In a way, I think it did. There's so many from the Third World. And again, I think of the Synod. It was like a warm-up for the conclave, because the Synod, too, people from all, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And one thing that a lot of, look at Africans, Asians, Middle Easterners, and many Europeans, too, would have in common is the English language.
Right.
And so someone that speaks English, at the Synod, I think we had 12 or 13 tables of English speakers, maybe 7 tables of Italian speakers, maybe 4 of French, maybe, English was the dominant language.
Right.
And English unites the world. That was a beautiful thing. I was, of course, at these English tables, but it meant you had prelates from Africa, Asia, Middle East, Europe, North America, all over the world. I think that was important, that there was an English speaker who was one of the candidates, united a lot of these disparate figures. And, let's face it, too, a lot of people that didn't know Rome very well, they weren't part of the kind of inside baseball crowd. They weren't curial people. And then the fact that Prevost was the head of the dicastery for bishops meant a lot of bishops knew him.
Right.
Because the ad limina visits, when bishops go to Rome, you meet with the Pope eventually, but you meet with all the curial department heads, and one of the main ones would be bishops. And because we always have concerns or issues or questions, and so he would have met a lot of bishops from around the world, including cardinals. All that contributed to it, I think. He was, I think, something of a compromise candidate, which is often the case in conclaves. If, let's say, a Parolin that everyone mentioned, I think he did get a lot of votes. Erdo, on the conservative side, I think did get a lot of votes. But it became clear pretty quickly, I think, that neither one was going to carry the day. I've heard there's rumors of other names like Tagle and others that might have gotten some attention. Even Cardinal Sarah, I heard that. And this will come out. It always happens. They take vows secrecy, but it all comes out eventually. That Sarah got some votes, but they knew it would never carry the day. And then they begin casting about for a compromise. And I think Prevost, for a lot of reasons, emerged as a compromise.
Bishop, help us understand when we use the word, liberal and conservative within ecclesial circles. I think the outside world's temptation is to immediately impose political categories on there. So what do those terms mean more specific when you call, for example, Erdo a more conservative candidate versus Parolin?
Well, let's say when I'm using liberal here, maybe someone closely associated with the Pope Francis program. Synodality, the outreach to the margins, great stress on social justice, right? Conservative, someone more in the John Paul II model. Erdo would be seen as a John Paul II type figure, perhaps more concerned with doctrinal clarity, with the new evangelization, etc. So I'm speaking very broadly there, but there are some of those ideological points of demarcation.
Another very important dimension of the conclave, again, before we move into looking at Pope Leo in more detail, is just the media presence that was there. And you were intimately involved with all of these different major media networks. And what I found fascinating is they sent their A-list talent to go cover the conclave. And so I wanted to get your sense of why do you think there's such external interest in what's going on at the conclave, and to the degree they're sending their top talent, especially when a lot of the same media doesn't share the same values that the church has.
They know the importance of the papacy. Period. Whether you like the Pope or not, whether you like the Catholic Church or not, they know the power of the papacy. He's the most important religious figure in the world, and that's not Catholic jingoism or putting anybody down. It's just the fact. The most recognizable, the most influential religious leader in the world is the Pope. And so, naturally, the people are interested. Does he have a huge political and cultural impact? Yes, obviously. So the news people are interested in that. Also, I would say the inherent drama of it. I mean, no one does drama better than the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
we invented it in a way. You know, that what we call theater and all that often it really came out of the Catholic liturgy.
Yeah.
And so just the fact of, the smoke and the Sistine Chapel and then the dramatic appearance of the Pope on the loggia. I mean, all that stuff is so beautifully crafted, and it's just designed for television and designed for drama and what's happening. And no one does that better. And so, the news people, they all love that. I found they were all interested. I appeared on a whole slew of networks this time. 12 years ago, I was with NBC exclusively. This time we did kind of a freelance thing, which I like better. I was on CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, Fox, EWTN, all these different outlooks. And they were all good. They were all interested. They would usually, by the end of the brief interview, try to get you into a political position, and I would just tend to deflect those questions.
Yeah, you did so very deftly. But
That's what I would do.
They always tried to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would talk about Catholic social teaching. I think this Pope is coming out of a Catholic social teaching tradition, which is
Right.
neither left nor right. And, but I found they were very interested and they were, pleasant and friendly.
As part of my duty as host to represent our loyal viewers, burning questions, I have to ask you, Bishop, about the Panama Jack hat.
Oh. Exactly
Which you got a lot of compliments on, by the way.
Yeah, no, I was happy about that. It was the sunburn. It's from Donald Trump. It was the fact that I was in the Rose Garden and I got this terrible sunburn.
Yeah.
So my skin was kind of peeling. It was like being a kid again. I played too much baseball outside as a kid. And so I'd come to these interviews and, on my skin, they had to kind of give me extra makeup and all this. So then someone said, look, get a hat.
Yeah.
So protect yourself. And so we saw one of the priests there had that hat. I said, where'd you get that hat? And he told me the store, and so we just made a beeline. It was 10 minutes away, and within 5 minutes, they had the right size, and I said, all right, I'll take it. And so I wore it. It wasn't just for show. It's wherever you were, if the sun was out, I had that hat on to protect myself.
Well, you've rebranded it now as the Bishop Barron hat.
Good.
So Panama Jack.
It's
it's Bishop
It's a
Barron
good hat. Yeah, it's a good hat.
All right. Well, let's now look, of course, at the fact that we do have the first American Pope, the first United States citizen Pope. Now, he made it very clear when he first came out on the loggia, and he spoke in Latin, he spoke in Spanish, and he spoke in Italian. So he didn't speak in English. He is a man of the world, 2 decades in Peru, a Peruvian citizen,
Right.
but also a guy from the south side of Chicago. So, Bishop, you spent a lot of time in the Vatican. What's your sense of how the Vatican sees the American church, and are they going to impose that perception on the new Pope?
The line that was going around all the time was that people evidently were saying he's the least American of the Americans. I frankly find that insulting.
It is insulting.
But that's the line that I find it credible that some of the Italians would have said that, that if like a Cardinal Dolan was sort of sum up the stereotype of the kind of boisterous American, Prevost was the opposite extreme, kind of quiet and more international in style and all that. All right. I think at the end of the day, honestly, they voted for the man. I don't know if they were that preoccupied with his provenance and his citizenship. I think they recognized qualities in him that were papal. So I don't know if there's any great statement being made. People ask about, was it a rebuke to Trump and all that? I just don't think they were thinking along those lines. They saw him as a guy, for a variety of reasons, uniquely positioned for this job. So I don't know. I wouldn't want to overstate the American thing.
So you noted the importance of the fact that he's a native English speaker in getting elected among the cardinals.
Yeah.
How about for the sort of the future of the church, especially evangelically, the fact that we now have a native English speaker who's going to be speaking to the world?
I think it's great, and I'm sure already it's awakened a deeper interest in Americans in the church. I've thought a lot about this. I've now lived through a number of popes, and I've been bishop under going back to. Francis. Of course, Francis may be a bishop. But, when you meet a pope, you think, okay, now what language will I speak? And will I understand him? And, he's coming from a totally different cultural background. The fact that if I have the pleasure, I hope someday to meet Leo as pope, that I'm going to a guy from the south side of Chicago.
Yeah, right.
That he's someone completely from my world. I think I said in a couple interviews, he grew up about a 25-minute drive from where I did. I grew up in Western Springs, southwest suburbs. He grew up in Dalton. Good traffic, he'd be there in 25 minutes. We're roughly the same age. He's maybe 4 years older or 5 years older than I am. So we're from the same, cultural matrix. That's interesting that I'll approach the Pope in a very different way, and that's, it's all to the good.
I'm really looking forward to his first encyclicals, which may first be written in English. That'll be fascinating.
Wonder.
So another very notable feature of the new Pope is that he's from a religious order, the Augustinians, and another first, the first Augustinian to be elected to the papacy. So let's explore that a little bit, that dimension, deep dimension of his identity. Say a little bit, Bishop, about the special charism that the Augustinians have and how that we see that unfold in his papacy.
Yeah, it's an ancient order going back to Augustine himself, who gathered around himself in Hippo, the priests of his diocese, and they lived in a kind of monastic way. And that's the beginning of the Augustinian order, which is ancient, and it's endured all these centuries. It bears the marks of Augustine, of deep intelligence. He was a man of the heart as well, so it's that combination. They're involved in education. They're involved in missionary work, as this man was most of his career. But I think it's the Augustinian stamp, as Francis had the Ignatian stamp. And when people ask me about Francis, I did a lot on his legacy. You can't overlook his Jesuit identity. That was the key to so much of Francis, was he was a Jesuit. And the whole discernment thing, that synodality came up out of Jesuit discernment. So we'll see now with this Pope. He described himself, remember on the Loggia, as a filio di Agostino.
Right.
He's a son of Augustine.
That's right.
Okay, that's very telling. Augustine's one of my great heroes. One of the 2 or 3 most important figures in the history of the church, period. So I'd look to all that. I quote him all the time with, Lord, you made us for yourself, therefore our heart is restless till it rests in thee. That's the greatest statement of Christian anthropology. It's the foundational statement of our anthropology. And that's very much in tune with evangelization, to know that truth. The confessions, Pope Benedict said, if he was on a desert island and had 2 books, one would be the Bible, the other would be the Confessions of Augustine. So, that's a huge influence on this man.
One of the major theological themes in St. Augustine is this hyper awareness of the depth and depravity of sin, of original sin and ongoing sin, and then the correlation of the absolute beauty and necessity of grace, so those 2 things together.
Right.
Do you see that as sort of influencing how he's going to see his relationship, not only with the church, but with the world? We're getting a more sober analysis of the possibility of temporal peace, things like that?
Yeah, we'll see. Right, and like the City of God.
Right.
One of his, 3 greatest works, and setting up a contrast between Rome, essentially, as this kind of paradigm of the city of man, and then the church, the city of God. And a very clear-eyed sense of the fallenness of the world, and the way we organize ourselves politically as being deeply compromised. Augustine saw all of that, and saw the church as this little, like Noah's Ark, kind of bobbing its way through the centuries, but the bearer of the true order of things. Summed up, Augustine says, in right praise. That's for the liturgy.
Right.
And I've used, ever since I read that, I've used it as a basic idea in my own thinking, is, right praise, wrong praise. And we organize ourselves incorrectly in the measure that we praise something other than God. That's always the question. So like a secular society, it's never really non-religious. Everyone's religious. You worship something. So secularity worships, pick your poison, money or sex or pleasure or power or freedom, right? Well, then you're going to organize yourselves in a dysfunctional way if you do that. But if you worship the true God, now the right kind of society will emerge. I think, sure, that's bound to influence this man's thinking. It's his whole formation.
What do you take of the motto he chose, which in Latin is in illo uno unum, which means in the one Christ we are one?
That's Augustine too,
Right.
And in his coat of arms, he's got the Augustinian, the pierced heart, right, which is a symbol of Augustine. And you think of, the cor ad cor loquitur of Newman, which is kind of an Augustinian with the restless heart and all that. And that's Augustine. In Christ, we find our unity. Don't seek it somewhere else. You seek it somewhere else, you're not going to find it. In fact, you're going to fall apart. So, right, in the one Christ, we're head and members. And so the totus Christus, Augustine says, the entire Christ, that's the church, head and members together. Where's that expressed? In the liturgy. See, and I'm influenced there by Pope Benedict, who was deeply Augustinian. Or again, the liturgy is not some little, side offering for hobbyists of Christianity. It's what it is all about. The liturgy is where we act out who we are, right? So we'll see with this man too if the liturgical interest plays itself out.
So that was Augustine's commentary on Psalm 127, and I looked it up just very briefly. I thought it was interesting. It says, "Unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guard the city, in vain does the guard keep watch." Seems to be a shift from a focus on what can we do as individuals, what can we do in the world, to what is the Lord doing.
He's the doctor of grace, right? So grace comes first, right, and all that.
Do you see, so one of the comments you made on a regular basis before his election was that you were hoping to see a papacy that really stressed sort of the supernatural dimensions of the faith, specifically the proclamation of the gospel of Christ crucified and Christ resurrected. Are you seeing indications that that's where this papacy is already moving?
It's the first thing he said, isn't it, about declaring the risen Christ in the gospel? Yeah, see, what was annoying me, and I said this, I think on X, and I said it on TV as well, is this relentless politicization. So,
right.
What's your political position on immigration? Well, all right, there are ethical and indeed political implications that follow from the gospel. True. But the gospel is not your position on immigration. The gospel is Jesus Christ risen from the dead. That's the good news. Are you able in a compelling way to announce that? Do you believe it? And do you want the world to know about it? Now, from that, follows conversion. From conversion follows moral renovation. From moral renovation follows certain political convictions. Okay. But when we rush to, what's your political view on X, Y, or Z? We're missing the forest for trees, or we're missing the essential thing. The Pope's job is to declare the resurrection. So that's what the Pope should do,
So let's look at least briefly at the name that Cardinal Previs chose, Leo XIV. Of course, this is in the line coming after Leo XIII.
Yeah.
So what significance do you see in that choice?
I see a lot in it, and I was very pleased when I heard his name, because I said this on the air too a couple times, is think of the recent papal names. Almost every one of them would have been really loaded. If you said, I'm John Paul III, okay, and now I kind of know where you are. I'm John the 24th. All right, now we know this guy's going to.
Yeah.
I'm Pius the 13th, okay. Almost any, or I'm Francis II, right? Any of those would have right away pigeonholed someone. The fact that he went back well over 100 years to this indeed pivotal player, Pope from 1878, I think, till 1903. So it avoided this difficulty of getting pigeonholed right away. And he chose someone who indeed is reverenced by more liberal Catholics and more conservative Catholics. Leo XIII, the father of the modern Catholic social teaching tradition, Rerum Novarum. So you might say the liberal Catholics really like that, social justice. At the same time, Leo gives us the St. Michael prayer. Leo, who saw very clearly that the 20th century would be a century that belongs to the devil and would be marked by the worst kind of moral outrage. And if someone's saying that in whenever he said that, late in his life, let's say 1900, what are you talking about? The 20th century is a century of progress and science and, economic reform and liberation. No, it's the Christian century, indeed, that the magazine. That was the confidence. He was right. I mean, the 20th century, arguably, is the worst century in human history in terms of the piling up of corpses. So, talk about someone who was very clear-eyed about sin and all that. Well, that was Leo XIII.
Right.
He's also the Pope of the Thomistic revival, which is very close to my own heart. He wanted to use Aquinas not as a way to go back to the Middle Ages, but to creatively engage modernity. The Church had said no largely to the political revolution of the 18th century and the philosophical innovations of the 19th century, especially Marxism. Leo is I would say, balanced and nuanced yes and no. And he's using Aquinas to make that response. My point here is that he's kind of, in a good way, all over the place. You can find things that liberals really like, conservatives really like, moderates really like in Leo XIII. So choosing that name, I think, was a real bridge-building move on his part.
Leo XIII was really addressing the vast and rapid changes that industrialization was wreaking a lot of havoc on society. Leo XIV is really looking at AI and technology. How do you see the sort of the resources that Leo XIII provided being helpful for addressing this different kind of change in society?
Yeah, he himself said that, didn't he, when he was asked about his name? I thought it was interesting because, there's this sort of change in technology and in political arrangement in the late 19th century, and then something analogous going on today. Heck, I'd still recommend Thomas Aquinas. It's not a bad way. You want to use Thomas to engage this new situation. But no, he's very alert to these things, which I think is quite interesting. There's nothing naive about him as he's looking at the situation today. And in choosing Leo, creative engagement with modernity, not simply the no, and not simply the yes of like certain post-conciliar types that would, the modern world sets the agenda for the church and we must yes to the modern world. No, as Leo said, yea and nay to the modern world of his time. So we must do that as well.
So wise.
Yeah.
In several interviews that you've already given, you've been identifying Leo XIV as a bridge figure. Yeah. Say a little bit more about how you interpret him in that way.
Well, I think he's alert to the fact that we have these divisions in the church. I think every smart person is. Some of the gestures he's made, many have pointed out, the wearing the mozzetta and the stole, the formal stole when he came out,
right,
I think was a gesture to more traditional Catholics to say, I'm in the traditional garb of the Pope. Pope Francis famously eschewed all of that, right? As we record this, I think it's true that he's decided to live in the apostolic palace.
Yes, right.
So that sort of move. And then things he said, too, that or even the singing of the Regina Caeli in Latin.
Right, that's beautiful.
Again, you might say these are little symbolic things, but we're trying to get a sense of where he's coming from. And then he's been very clear, too, about his commitment to social justice and the choice of the Leonine name and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think he's reaching out to, if you want, those two sides of the church in a good way.
Have you seen any indications yet that would help us predict how the synodal program that Francis laid out will continue or maybe not continue?
Well, he seems to be partial to it. He was part of it, and he said positive things about it. I've talked a lot about synodality. It depends on how you construe it. There were many dimensions of it that I thought were very positive. In fact, I'm having a synod in my own diocese this year in imitation of the Great Synod. And I think he affirms all of that. A church that, listens and includes more people in its decision-making process. The shadow side of it, as far as I'm concerned, is this kind of open-endedness. And what about with our doctrines being, reconsidered, things that have been sort of settled? Are they being unsettled?
Mm-hmm.
Or this sort of permanent debating society equality, like we're just going to keep talking to each other about these things endlessly, that we forget about the evangelical mission. That, to me, is the shadow side of synodality. My hope would be he retains what's good in it and cautions what's bad in it as it goes forward. But we'll have to see.
And finally, Bishop, before we turn to our listener question, what would you say are the 2 or 3 most pressing issues, both within the church and in relationship to the world, that Pope Leo is going to be confronting?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the new evangelization. I'm looking at the West. I think disaffiliation, especially of the young, being attentive to these positive signs right now of younger people who are turning toward religion. I think that's still, from Vatican II through the post-conciliar popes right up to him, is still the mission, the new evangelization, expressing the faith in a compelling way. Inside the church, the financial stuff. I heard that a lot when I was in Rome, and that's not my area. It's not my bailiwick, finances, But a lot of people said the cardinals are well aware that the church is in some trouble financially. And maybe we underestimate the role that his being an American played in, someone that can handle finances, or reconnect the church to some of its American supporters, some of whom fell away during the Francis years.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. But I think he does have to confront that issue. And I do think clarifying the synodal reality, as we just said, it would be a desideratum. To take what's valuable in it, but also to caution, what was problematic in it, to kind of ride herd on synodality, I think would be a top priority of this Pope.
Let's now turn to our listener question. Today we have Paul, all the way from Indonesia, again showing the reach of the ministry, asking about contemporary misunderstandings of Catholic theology.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Paul from Indonesia. My question is, what do you believe is the most misunderstood aspect of Catholic theology today? Thank you, Bishop Barron.
It's an interesting question. The most misunderstood aspect of Catholic theology. Well, you know what? I guess I would stay with this, that people think we're obsessed with sex and that we're just puritanical. We don't like sex. It's all about limiting our sexual experience. That's what, and I said before in regard to politics, yes, we get to those issues because they're implications from the gospel. But Catholic theology is about the incarnation. It's about the glory of God being a human being fully alive. It's about God's non-competitive transcendence. It's about grace. It's about liberation from the slavery of sin. That's what it's about. We start with all that. We lead with that. It's about the liturgy as the display of the Christian life. Then we get to issues political, moral, and ultimately sexual. The trouble, I think it's misunderstood as, well, Catholic theology is all about, saying no to people's sexual desires. No, it's not that. And when the church says no, it's always a no to a no. Because in Christ is always yes. He's only yes, Paul says. So when the church says no, don't do that, it's because that in question is something negative. That is something destructive. So the church says no to the no, which means it's saying yes, right? So I think that's the most misunderstood dimension of the church.
It's the heart of affirmative orthodoxy, right?
Affirmative orthodoxy, right.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for your question. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question in a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. And as always, we love to hear from you. Well, Bishop, this is going to be a highly watched show, I know. Thanks for the conversation. Looking forward to the next one.
Always a pleasure. Thanks.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. And we'll see you next time.